Thank you guys for tuning in. This is one part of my video series explaining the relationship between government, health, and the environment. The relationship between meat and our environment is heavily interwoven and impossible to fully explain in a short video. To go more in depth, I've broken up this topic into two different videos, one on climate change in lakes and the other on resource depletion. I've also provided all the resources that I use down below if you would like to explore the topic further. It's actually incredibly interesting with layers and layers of cause and effect. So today, I'll be focusing on the relationship between cattle and emissions, as well as a few of the direct consequences. Climate change, when simplified, is caused by greenhouse gases, like CO2 and methane being released into the atmosphere, creating a blanket over the planet. Our planet is warmed by the sun, and typically much of the heat from the sun is released back into space, maintaining a healthy temperature. That blanket, however, prevents this excess sun and excess heat from escaping, raising the global temperature, which is where we get global warming. From this, we have melting ice caps, rising sea levels, droughts, and severe storms and fires. These emissions are typically natural, absorbed by trees, plants, and plankton. Humans, however, have been emitting far more than the natural world can absorb, while also cutting down the trees that would have maintained that balance. Most of these emissions come from fossil fuels, cars, and coal. However, cars, coal, and fossil fuels are dwarfed compared to the emissions resulting from cattle. According to the United Nations News report, cattle generates more CO2 emissions than all global transportation combined. And CO2 isn't even the worst problem. Methane has 86 times more global warming potential, or GWP, 37% of which is produced by cattle. Then there's the issue of nitrous oxide, with 296 times the GWP, 65% of which is released by cattle. Cattle is also responsible for 64% of all ammonia, which significantly contributes to acid rain. Just think about that for a moment. To put that into perspective, fracking produces 100 billion tons of methane each year and is considered a severe hazard by environmentalist organizations. There is extreme pushback against fracking as it's unsustainable and killing our planet. Cattle, on the other hand, produces 34 trillion gallons of methane each year. The cattle industry is the primary contributor to climate change, and thus transferring to a diet without this meat consumption will cut down drastically on our global emissions. As Kirk R. Smith, professor of global environmental health at UC Berkeley says, if you reduce the amount of methane emissions in the atmosphere, the level in that atmosphere goes down fairly quickly within decades. As opposed to CO2, if you reduce the emissions in the atmosphere, you don't really see a signal in the atmosphere for another 100 years or so. What he's talking about is the discussion of cutting out fossil fuels. Now, this has been hailed as the only solution, but criticized because of the potential cost that comes with going net zero. On top of cost, CO2 stays in the atmosphere for centuries, while methane and nitrous oxide, both of which are more dangerous, dissipate much faster. Reducing meat consumption would thus result in a much faster halt to the disastrous effects of climate change. His testimony is part of the film Cowspiracy, which goes much more in depth into the link between climate and cattle. Now, in terms of storms, climate change is responsible for trillions of dollars of damage worldwide, from destroying whole islands to causing rivers and water sources to completely dry up. This is an issue that has already displaced millions of people, destroyed homes, and led to the destruction of species. The Sahara Desert is expanding, lakes are drying up, pushing communities further into poverty. This is the RLC in 1989 versus in 2005. This body of water was a source of food and employment for thousands in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The source is now gone, a direct result of water being drained specifically for cattle. That's on top of emissions resulting from those cattle and on top of fecal matter destroying the area around it. Or this one, Lake Poopó. Its drying has been directly linked to climate change and drought resulting from a changing climate. These are just 2 lakes, representing thousands of families, species, and wildlife who are struggling to combat the effects of cattle. Now, this is also just one of 3 videos in which I explore cattle in the environment. My next video will look at these resources specifically with water and land. Cattle and environment cannot really be fully explained without the second video, so I highly suggest you check that out. I will be providing all of the resources that I used below. One of them is Cowspiracy, as I mentioned earlier, available on Netflix and for individual purchase. It goes in depth with the environmental consequences of meat, which my videos will just touch upon. It's layered, it's interesting, and it completely changed my view on food and climate. See you guys in the next video.